The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, present the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World. In this session, Europe, Russia, and the Transatlantic Divide, Security Relations in Turbulent Times, we hear from Northeastern University's Dr. Mai'a Cross. The European Union has recently made many advancements in consolidating its common approach to foreign policy and security, from the 2016 Global Strategy to the launch of a European Defense Union. After many decades of attempting to achieve integration in the security and defense realm, following Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, the EU is on the cusp of creating a true European defense capability.
Mai'a Cross is the Edward W. Book Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University. Her research on European politics mainly centers on foreign and security policy, epistemic communities, crises, and diplomacy. Her two most recent books are Security Integration in Europe and The Politics of Crisis in Europe, both of which contain the word Europe, which is excellent. Mai'a is originally from Hawaii, and this is her first visit to Alaska, making it the 48th state she has visited. Hope you tell us what the other two are. 2 weeks ago, she was sailing on a boat off the coast of Kauai, but is still excited to get to see the glacier. We believe her, and thank you for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mai'a Cross.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. Thank you to the World Affairs Forum and the University of Alaska for inviting me. It's been a wonderful visit so far, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of days here. And I can verify, having gone from Kauai to here in a relatively short period of time, that the glacier is every bit as beautiful as the Nepali coast. So it was a pleasure this morning to have the chance, and thank you to Mary for escorting me around everywhere. It's just a beautiful city. Well, you can see from the slide the title of my talk, and I'm basically going to be talking about European security and the prospects for a defense union in Europe. So I want to start with something that happened back in 2004. The European Defense Agency, which was established the year before in 2003, decided to hold a series of high-level expert events to create a kind of long-term vision for the needs of Europeans in the coming years. And they were particularly thinking about what Europe would need in 20 years' time to secure itself. So they called this the long-term vision. And one of the outcomes of the deliberations that ensued over a period of weeks and months is the demographic challenge that they decided Europe faced at this point. And so as they were forecasting what would be the situation in 2025, and I guess we're kind of more than halfway there at this point since they held this meeting, they were very much concerned about the aging of the European population, and the fact that it would increasingly become a smaller and smaller percentage of the world population. So the forecast was that there would be less than 6% of people in the world who would be European, and the average age would be 45, and this would have really strong ramifications for European defense on a demographic level. As I note here, one of the big implications is that Europe, the European Union, would have a lower share of world wealth. But perhaps more importantly, there would be quite a bit of restrictions on budgets in terms of how they could actually allocate money towards defense. So more spending would be on pensions. And the conclusion from all of this was that essentially this was going to present a big strain on defense spending and recruitment to the armed forces. So this kind of provides the context over what Europeans have been trying to do over the past 14 years in light of this early meeting when the European Defense Agency was relatively new, and they were really trying to plan ahead what needed to be done. From this kind of conclusion and this discussion, they decided really that what they had to work on was avoiding duplication of spending in the coming years and striving to achieve interoperability. So that means that all of the security resources that they would acquire and develop would be usable across all of the member states. They would be interoperable. And this is actually a primary goal of NATO as well. So the Europeans were thinking about what do we need to be a security actor as the EU, but also to be a strong European pillar within NATO. And this quote from the report that they devised kind of captures what it is that they felt they needed to do. The quote from the EDA Deputy Chief Executive, Hilmar Linnenkamp, he said, "A good strategy would entail the blurring of distinctions between intergovernmental and common decision-making processes with respect to a range of issues." And he lists things like research and technology, industrial matters, crisis management, and humanitarian policy. So if you don't have a very deep knowledge of kind of the development of EU integration, this quote may seem pretty run-of-the-mill. But in fact, I would argue that it's actually quite a significant breakthrough. It's actually a very important acknowledgement that this very sensitive area of security, which, as you know, is core to national sovereignty, security would have to be subject to common decision-making processes. In other words, it would have to be integrated on some level. So in the EU literature, integration is used a lot as a term. It essentially means that over time, member states of the EU would have to give up some of their sovereignty to a central kind of decision-making body. And I think in this sense, the spirit of the long-term vision was, you know, most of security integration, most of this kind of defense apparatus would be subject to cooperation. So it's not that member states would fully give up their sovereignty, but on some level they would have to do that in order to achieve these goals of interoperability, avoiding duplication, and most importantly, the overarching conclusion is achieving economies of scale, because these are relatively small countries, and they're looking at becoming even smaller in the world and global context. Economies of scale was essentially a non-choice, and this was decided about 14 years ago. So the trade-off becomes between achieving security and efficiency and maintaining national sovereignty. They leaned towards the efficiency type side of the goal. So this is the context again for what I want to talk about today. I think what I really would like to focus on is 7 of the major challenges that the European Union is facing right now in the security realm. I'll go through those ones relatively quickly, but I want to finally end up with today's context and really why today, why in our world today, there's a significant catalyst towards more security integration. It's not the first time that Europe has experienced a catalyst of this kind, and I'm going to focus really on the way that Trump, Brexit, and Russia serve as this kind of collective catalyst. But I'll review some of the earlier catalysts that resulted in major steps forward in EU integration. And so along those lines, before getting to these 7 key challenges that I think really the EU has faced for quite a while since this EDA report, but continues to face, it's important to sort of set the stage with some of the history, because there's a big misconception I find about the EU that is really rampant whenever you read media coverage about the EU. And that is that the EU is just a kind of economic union, that it's just a trading bloc, and it's basically about the self-interest of the member states. They're looking for economic profit. And the minute that they cease to have that economic profit, journalists often predict the end of the EU. There's doom and gloom rhetoric about the EU. I have many slides that I show in other presentations where the covers of The Economist feature the euro going down in flames and just Europe falling off a cliff. Every few years, like clockwork, the EU is depicted as falling apart. And I think a lot of this stems from this misconception about the historical origins of the EU. And in particular, what I want to say about that is since its very foundings in the ashes of World War II, the European project has been about security. So we tend to see the economic manifestation of it, but it actually has always been about security. And so in my view, when the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, that was very appropriate, if not long overdue. So if we look back at the early years of, World War II, and Europeans are struggling to come out of it. Yes, their economies are in shambles, but one of the chief things on their minds, both at the elite level and at the popular level, is how do we prevent this violence from recurring in Europe? How do we prevent World War III? They're looking back at centuries of bloody violence in Europe, and they're fed up, and they're asking for something significant, something to ensure peace. So one of the first major ideas that comes out of all of this is the idea of a United States of Europe. There was this strong impetus to create federalism, something comparable to the United States in Europe. They thought, many of these federalists, that this kind of political organization would ensure peace because it would mean this kind of full-scale merging of sovereignty. They thought at the time that nationalism and an emphasis on national sovereignty was the cause of war. So it's no surprise that the first kind of impetus, the first step towards European integration was the European coal and steel community. Many people look back at that and they say, well, it looks, a little bit minor and small compared to these grandiose visions of the United States of Europe. But coal and steel were the key war-making materials at the time. And when they formed this coal and steel community, they explicitly gave up sovereignty to a central authority in just the few years after World War II. So it was a significant move, and it was precisely so that especially France and Germany could watch each other as they engaged in, economic recovery, and particularly watch each other when it came to war-making materials. At exactly that same period of time, we're talking early 1950s, late 1940s, when these discussions were happening, another piece of evidence of why the European Union has always been about security was the proposal in 1950 to create a European defense community. So this also very significant. It ended up not getting passed, but the fact that all of the member states at the time, 6 countries, fully agreed to this notion is quite stunning, because it envisioned a significant formation of a European army, all with soldiers, including French and Germans, with the same uniforms fighting under the same flag. So you can imagine how it would have been ultimately difficult for parliaments to stomach. And although it was a French idea, eventually the French parliament actually voted it down. Nonetheless, it shows, there are these multiple attempts over time, over the decades, to make the EU into a security kind of union. We can trace this again in the 60s. There was an effort by de Gaulle under the Fouché plan, again, to create some kind of common security. The Western European Union, although it was outside of the structures of the EU, again, was about common security. It sort of continues these efforts, these sincere efforts to do something. And it's not really, though, until 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty that finally the common foreign and security policy is signed. So that's kind of the moment at which finally the countries, because this is such a hard area to agree upon, you do have to look at the core kind of idea of national sovereignty and be willing to loosen it up and to give up some shared authority to others. With the Maastricht Treaty, they were able to do this. And the Maastricht Treaty explicitly talks about asserting the EU's identity on the international scene, including the eventual framing of a common defense. And they talk about saying that member states should refrain from any action which is contrary to the interests of the Union. So they signed this into being, but it's just a kind of first step. And so it then takes a number of catalysts. Maybe you could call them crises. On some level, they're very different in nature, but a series of catalysts emerged over time that spurred on security integration. And this is kind of where I get back to my introductory point about how I think we're actually in the middle of one of those catalysts right now. So just to review that, what these catalysts look like. First of all, the end of the Cold War happens, which of course is a major event in anybody's book. But what happens is Europeans notice that the US is not so interested in Europe. It seems to be turning away from, a kind of very, very strong emphasis on the EU and what it's doing. And so the Europeans really use this as a reason to talk about that common foreign and security policy that I just mentioned. So as the Cold War wraps up, you have that first step in 1992, the treaty that launches the common foreign and security policy. Then a few years later, through the mid-90s into the late 90s, the second catalyst happens. And this is the Balkan Wars, especially I would say Kosovo. Because what happened in this event was that Europeans had the benefit of their common foreign and security policy, but they realized when it really came down to it, they had no capacity actually to act. They wanted to act in Kosovo. It's right in their neighborhood, it should be their responsibility, and it's specifically for something like this that they wanted to have this foreign policy. But without any actual operational capacity, they ultimately relied on NATO and in particularly the United States to deal with that and Kosovo, and they didn't really like the way that the United States dealt with it. So this was a catalyst again for actually bringing the British and French together on an agreement which is the common security and defense policy. So it sounds very similar to the foreign and security policy, but it was a significant step forward because what they said in this agreement was that the EU should from now on have the capacity for autonomous action backed up by credible military forces, and that they would have this capacity separate but not separable from the United States. So it's important to remember that as the EU over the decades is crafting its own security and defense, it's always looking to the United States. It's looking to the US for sort of encouragement and approval. It's figuring out how far it should go. And this becomes quite significant when I come back to talking about Trump and the way he's been dealing with this. So you have that second catalyst, and now the EU is trying to find a way to have the capacity to act militarily. The third catalyst, I would say, is the US rift with Europe under Bush. So when George W. Bush was president, it was clear there emerged a transatlantic divide. And I would say there's some parallels as well with our current situation. When you see the emergence of a division in this very, very important alliance between the US and Europe, you often see as a result a strengthening of European security capacity. You see steps forward in EU security integration. And it's because, just as my colleagues have been talking about, it concerns the Europeans when there's a very different normative approach stemming from the United States. When the US is pursuing a foreign policy that would seem to kind of really fly in the face of what Europeans want to do, and in this case, it was very much the Iraq invasion, Europeans start stepping up to the plate more and saying, we must take very seriously this separate but not separable kind of autonomous capacity to act. So with this catalyst from the invasion of Iraq, Europeans signed for the first time the European Security Strategy in 2003. And this was kind of their first attempt at having an articulated national, like comparable to the US's national security strategy, but at a European level. It's again, very nascent. These are early processes, early attempts, but it was the first time that they agreed and put onto paper this European security strategy. The fourth catalyst is more of an internal security issue, but it's worth mentioning because although when it first started with 9/11 and the rhetoric of war on terror, or the language of war on terror, the challenges of terrorism, and in particular the last couple of years with the multiple terrorist attacks in multiple European countries, has served as a catalyst for security integration on the internal side. So you see more policies that actually define terrorism across the board in a common way for Europeans. Initiatives like the European Arrest Warrant, the strengthening of Europol, many other initiatives, the strategy on radicalization and recruitment, European ways of trying to tackle terrorism through intelligence sharing, foreign policy, and so on. And then finally, this catalyst that is now taking place, it is this, as I would see it, a combination of the effect of Brexit, Russia, and Trump. And I'm going to come back to this at the very end after I go through some of the challenges. But just to give you the quick version of it, with Brexit, because the British have been this kind of spoiler or this veto player when it comes to efforts at a common security, the British departure actually creates new opportunities for Europeans to move forward in this area. The British may not necessarily fully leave defense cooperation. It's not a foregone conclusion. But the fact that they are not kind of eventually going to be in the room voting on things actually helps smooth the way for defense union. Russian aggression creates more of that kind of external impetus for Europeans to think about, again, territorial defense and what they need to do to take security seriously. And Trump, as I mentioned already, is almost a kind of parallel phenomenon with Bush in this respect, in that he precipitates this sense of divide between US and the European Union, which means, again, that they really want to think about how can they act alone without the United States, or how might they be forced to act if the United States is no longer on board with some of the standard goals that this transatlantic alliance has had. So I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. But just to give you a sense of what the EU has been up to since these catalysts, especially the second catalyst when they gained a capacity to act, is they've launched almost or around 30 missions and operations across 3 continents under this umbrella of the Common Security and Defense Policy. They're relatively small. So again, this is so much at the beginning, not a fully developed kind of thing, but you have now people, both military and civilian personnel, operating under an EU flag. These are the completed missions and operations. The ones with the green rings are the military ones, blue are civilian. And these are the ones that are currently ongoing in various countries with various goals. You know, everything from kind of stopping piracy off the coast of Somalia to securing Kosovo, doing border management in the Palestinian territories, and so on. There's a broad remit in terms of what these missions and operations actually do. But again, as you can see with the number of people deployed and the objectives, it's still, of course, relatively small scale, which just makes, you know, the current catalyst that we can observe now even more important to look at. There's talk of defense union, which I'll come back to. But I don't mean to imply that, you know, all of these actions are just the result of crises. The EU has actually done very careful and gradual work towards crafting a common voice, being able to speak with one voice in foreign policy. And these are just a few examples of it. So EU security doesn't just look like these, you know, limited missions and operations. It's also about, of course, diplomacy and using normative power and using soft power and other things. So just a few examples. And I would say this bottom line here is probably the strongest because these are the most integrated areas internally. If the EU is very integrated internally, then it's not as difficult to turn externally and turn that into foreign policy. So now I'll just move on to these 7 key challenges that I want to talk about as far as security is concerned for Europe. So the first one is probably the most important and most talked about. It's the so-called capabilities gap. And so this is what, you know, people in Brussels, where the major decisions are made in this area, will discuss a lot. And it's essentially the difference between what the EU has and what it can actually do. So if we look at just military spending, the EU doesn't look all that bad. It would come up to a number that is second only to the United States in terms of expenditure, and you can see it's much more than China and Russia. But this is actually a bit of a misnomer looking at it this way, because when you look at defense spending, it's by member states, right? So that figure just adds up all of the member states together and results in a kind of overarching number. But it doesn't account for, as I said, all of the duplication that's occurring here when you see this amount of spending. So estimates are that basically the EU spends about half what the US spends, or you could say even less, because if you add other things to the US military expenditure, it can balloon up into a trillion, depending on how you count it. But if we go with it just at this level, the EU spends about half, and it only gets about 15% of the capability out of it. Why? Because you don't yet have economies of scale. It goes back to my introductory point from 2004. They know they need economies of scale. They know they're duplicating spending and that it is not efficient. But overall, they're trying to work towards that. For now, though, you're only getting 15% out of it in all of that duplication of spending. So just to give you an example, the EU has 28 armies, 24 air forces, and 21 navies, all doing roughly the same thing, right, on bigger or smaller scales. The United States, as a comparison, or Russia and China, they have one of each of these things. So it's much, much more efficient. So the question is, can the EU overcome this? Can it resolve the capabilities gap? It's going to be a challenge in the coming years. This is just defense data from the Defense Agency, and it's a little dated because it's 2014, 2015, which is the most recent data they've released. But it gives you a sense of the unevenness of the defense spending that occurs across these European countries. That's just the absolute number, whereas the defense expenditure as percent of GDP gets us to an image that shows that 2% goal. So the previous speaker emphasized that as the benchmark standard. EU member states want to strive towards the 2% goal. But something I would suggest is actually that the 2% goal is a little arbitrary, because when you have so much duplication of spending, in effect, the EU could not even increase its spending at all and simply resolve the duplication problem and the efficiency problem, and it would have vastly more capability from that without even spending that much more in terms of defense. But nonetheless, they recognize the importance of the NATO benchmark, and they're definitely working toward it. So that's kind of a look at that capabilities gap. But what do they actually have as the EU? When you look at missions and operations and you think about, what if the EU wanted to do a humanitarian intervention somewhere on a large scale, what would it have? The battle group concept has been around for a little over 10 years now, and it's basically two groups of 1,500 troops that are standing at any point. They have another 1,500 in support of those troops. They've never been used. It's been a kind of controversial point to use them, but something that's in discussion now is perhaps revising that to make them more usable. But if there's anything like a European standing army, it's been that, very, very tiny. But in these early kind of years of trying to build European security, even any impetus towards creating some kind of capacity is significant to look at. The Berlin Plus agreement is where the EU uses NATO assets. So it would be the EU's command structure and its decision on what to do, but it would borrow NATO assets in effect. What they typically do is this process called force generation, which is every time they decide they do want to act militarily, and it's true for the civilian side as well, they will ask the member states to contribute what they can. They will generate forces to contribute what they can to go to the Congo, for instance, and hope that they will get enough based on a kind of catalog that they maintain of what the member states have. How they pay for it is this so-called Athena mechanism, which is that each member state will pay for an operation as a percent of GDP. So some countries with a large GDP, like Germany, will pay a lot more in absolute dollars than a tiny country like Malta. But that's how they pay for it. So even if a country doesn't necessarily want to provide the helicopters or the tanks or the troops, they will still be contributing some money. And then finally, there is that European Defense Agency that I started with. That's really trying to facilitate the interoperability, the efficiency, the combined defense research, the combined innovations in security technology. So that's kind of what they have. That's what's at their disposal if you think of the European Union as some kind of security and defense actor. The second major challenge is deployability of troops. So this is something that is a bit hard to actually put your finger on lately, because with this resurgence in Russian aggression, EU member states are not quite sure whether the troops are deployable to some degree. If you think about deployability, NATO has this benchmark of 40% should be deployable, and the question is deployable to do what? So before Russia started to, go into Ukraine and pose a real threat to the territory potentially of the European Union, deployability was defined as being able to do these rapid reaction humanitarian peacekeeping operations. And in that sense, the EU had a long ways to go. Member states had a long ways to go to make their troops deployable, especially since more and more would be sent to outside of Europe. To give you a sense of that, in 1995, 85% of European troops were actually sent to multinational crises within Europe, and just 10 years later, this went down to 39%. So the deployability benchmark was, can they go these long distances away from Europe? And if we look at, again, EDA data, the 40% threshold is there coming from NATO, and this is sort of how the countries stood. Germany and Italy in this graph hadn't reported the data yet, so it's not that they were at zero or anything terrible like that, but it's the countries are kind of like quite uneven in that sense. So the third major challenge along the lines of deployability is reforming the armed forces, because if they all are geared towards these Cold War kinds of scenarios and things are moving into these multinational rapid reaction crisis response issues, the forces have to be capable of those kinds of things. These being used frequently in a wide diversity of contexts, being able to be flexible, mobile, learning from experiences. And in particular, they've struggled with having troops that can actually engage in high intensity tasks. So tasks that really look like battlefield scenarios with weapons and so on. Only the UK and France have been capable of those kinds of scenarios, whereas the other countries in the EU are kind of divided evenly between low intensity and medium to high intensity, which means, again, they're limited in terms of what it is they can do. So again, all of this is shifting because now there's more of a sense that maybe these Cold War scenarios, not that we're anywhere close to being in a Cold War, but the kinds of battlefield scenarios may be becoming a reality again. And so they're thinking about how exactly do they need to train and reform the armed forces. The fourth challenge has been this question of an operational headquarters. So you see there, the EU has long had this kind of space, this office space in Brussels, in the hopes that they would have a shared operational headquarters. In all of these missions and operations so far, they've had the headquarters change depending on which country was being the lead on a particular operation. So they'd have 5 or so different locations where there would be an operational headquarters, which is not terribly efficient, right? The NATO in Europe has shape, so it has one operational headquarters. And so reasonably, the EU countries who want this have been saying, if NATO can have it, shouldn't we have that since we're doing all of these missions and operations? The UK has objected to it, though. So this is one of those things where, with the prospects of Brexit, this is a pretty easy thing to resolve. It's much more efficient and so on. So moving on to the fifth major challenge. It's more on the civilian side. So if you recall those two maps that I showed you with all those missions and operations, and the green, circle was military, the blue was civilian, this is a key thing, because effectively the civilian side of Europe's security and defense policy has taken off in a way that was relatively unexpected. It has these kinds of priority areas as listed here, involving police missions. So a police mission would be sending some European police to kind of like partner up with local police in a third country to help train them and deal with situations they might find on the ground, like, learning, transferring best practices, coming up with solutions to things that might work better for people, so creating that kind of stabilization. It could also involve sending judges over to help set up a nice administrative system or court system, civil protection, how to do monitoring, and so on. So the fact that the EU has been able to develop this, and as I keep emphasizing always, it's very nascent. These are small missions and operations, but nonetheless, it starts to give the EU this sense of added value as compared to NATO, that they can do civilian missions and that they can really develop this as a strength. At the same time, though, they're much more challenging to maintain than military, because as you can sort of think of intuitively, militaries, you have standing armies, you have military bases and troops, and they're being trained and they're practicing various scenarios, and when they're called upon to go somewhere, they go, they're available, as long as they're deployable, right? But in the case of civilian actors, these people are actually at home serving as police on the streets of Paris, or engaging in civil protection in Spain, or whatever it is they're doing. They have jobs at home, and so it becomes, as you try to ramp up the number of civilian personnel going on civilian missions, it becomes difficult to find people that you can ask to kind of leave their homes and their families for a few months and travel off to a developing country and try to help with sharing of best practices and so on. So this is something that the EU is kind of thinking about, how to improve that, and what sort of like solutions might there be in terms of civilian capabilities. Right now they do have a kind of list, like a catalog of what each member state could potentially provide in a given scenario as far as civilian types of resources. So for example, there's a list of 5,700 police who are potentially available, 630 rule of law experts, 560 civil administration experts. So these are the personnel they're talking about. Pretty small scale, but prepared to kind of go on these missions. Sixth, and actually quite importantly, is the question of European strategic culture. Because if you start to think about all these capabilities and resources, and you're kind of pushing Europeans to spend more, hoping they become more interoperable, the question or idea of political will and how far the countries are willing to go, whether they're really on the same page in terms of worldview, is a very important one, right? Whether they actually want to do these things in the same kind of level. So strategic culture, I have a quick definition up there. A common mindset leading to common strategies to understanding and approaching security. I mentioned a few minutes ago that 2003 European security strategy, which came after the kind of catalyst of the Iraq War. So that was an effort to kind of articulate some kind of common ground. It had to be broad enough to encompass all those different kinds of views. But why do they have these different views? Well, they have different constitutions, some of which, like in the case of Germany, restrict the use of force in many cases. So how are the constitutions of the country structured to allow use of force? Different historical experiences. So, of course, some countries are more anti-militarist. Some countries are neutral countries, right? Some countries like France perhaps are more prepared to use force, and especially in kind of former colonies are interested in humanitarian and peacekeeping operations. They feel they have a responsibility there. There's also different perceptions of threat. How dangerous is the Russian threat, for instance? Certain countries like Greece and Turkey also have unresolved territorial disputes. How much of a threat is Turkey's change in politics lately? So depending on geographic location and historical relationship, those perceptions can vary quite a bit. And then levels of ambition. You have sort of low level ambition, medium, high. Countries fall into different groups over how much do they actually want to do. So this kind of pushes against the grain a little bit from what I was talking about in that 2004 long-term vision and that expressed will, that expressed need to kind of achieve economies of scale. But this has actually been changing, and I'm kind of getting back to what I want to talk about as far as the current situation. But if we look at what does the public think and what are the differences in conceptions of what sort of security actor the European Union should be. Well, at the public level, there's not much concern here as to whether common security and defense is controversial. We can look back to Eurobarometer opinion polls, and Eurobarometer is every 6 months they poll a bunch of people across member states on various measures of what they think about the EU, whether it's the euro, or do they feel they have a European identity, or do they want the EU to have a common security and defense? So looking back to as far as 1993, when the question was first asked, the majority in all member states, including the UK actually, favor more common security and defense, and the number is pretty high on average, so that's just the average. Some are much lower than 77%, but it hovers just around a little below 80% as far as support for a European level of security and defense. The member states themselves, especially the big ones, have different views of what this common security and defense policy should be, when it should be used. So the British have articulated more or less, a use of the common security and defense policy in limited and urgent cases. They kind of would rather look toward NATO and see if NATO is really the right instrument for it. But they do think CSDP is good. They agree to it and would be happy to use it in particular cases. We'll see if that's true after Brexit. But it's not unprecedented for a non-EU member state to participate in this. Turkey and Norway regularly contribute to the common security and defense policy, for example. France sees it as a means of sort of enhancing French influence, so they like it, they would like to use it, they're often the lead nation. Germany would like to catch up. It's not a small military by any means in comparison to other European ones, but they would like to catch up and have more of a role in CSDP. The neutral members historically neutral, are worried that it could over-militarize the EU. So when the CSDP moved more onto the civilian side, they were kind of happy with that. They were more comfortable with the civilian types of missions. The Central and Eastern European countries tend to be a little more oriented towards NATO. So there's definitely a spread here. And yet, there is this movement towards integration. And I have some quotes here from some countries in 2012, 2013 to sort of illustrate this. I picked this time period in particular because, in 2004, as I started with, when they were talking about defense budgets being strained, they had no idea that in about 5 years they were going to be hit with the Eurozone crisis. So talk about defense budgets being constrained. And so these quotes are from just around the time when the worst of the Eurozone crisis was wrapping up. So Belgium says it's better to have collective capabilities rather than non-existent national ones. So it's kind of more of this sort of functional reality of if we're going to have any capability at all, it's going to have to be European. So that's better than nothing. Italy, and there you see the quote, if EU member states do not pool their efforts where appropriate on certain common requirements or capabilities, none of them, nor Europe as a whole, will be able to guarantee its own security. So a similar acknowledgement, realization that essentially it's a non-choice, right, if you want to have security at all. Oh, did it not switch? Okay. France, a sort of joint Franco-German paper said, in times of strategic uncertainty and limited resources, strengthened defense requires common procurement. So this economies of scale logic carrying through more sharply felt in this Eurozone period. A think tank piece, if Europeans are to continue to count for something in the world, then they are condemned to cooperate. So this interesting twist of, again, this is core to national sovereignty. So it's not exactly something that leaders want to just give away, but they're talking about, to be a presence or not. It's framed as a non-choice. Germany on its own, though, I think takes it a little further, illustrating the kind of spread of how people really see this. The ability of the EU to take effective action in security matters can only be strengthened if member states give up part of their national sovereignty, really explicit, right? To operate to good effect, the CSDP should ideally pool the military capabilities of member states and share command and control responsibilities to such an extent that it would no longer be possible to enforce single national reservations. So this is on one end of the spectrum, full on, and I think actually you get quite a bit of this rhetoric today with the current catalyst. That it's about being willing to give up national sovereignty to make this effective. It's great to be able to cooperate, but cooperating falls short of integrating, right? Cooperating is every country has a vote and a veto. Integrating is, and I think someone defined qualified majority voting earlier, that in some cases you may not be that thrilled about the operation, but you're willing to kind of lend your support. And I have to say, even informally, in the research that I've done, I've interviewed almost all of the highest level military generals and admirals in the EU who make this policy. And they said, we actually have what they call a gentleman's agreement to adopt a silent procedure. So before even moving forward with defense union, they say, if a couple of colleagues, one or two, doesn't want to move forward with a particular thing, we remain silent. So we don't prevent the others, because it would create this sense of bad will among the group. And they want to be able to feel collegial, to feel that they're helping kind of the common goal of whatever it might be. And so whether you have these formal initiatives or not, and now we're looking at the formal possibility of the beginnings of a defense union, the EU has de facto operated in this kind of spirit of cooperation or even informal integration, I would say. So we get to the final challenge, which brings me back to this catalyst that I think we're looking at today. And I've already said a little bit, so I'm going to elaborate just on those three, and then kind of wrap up with the future prospects for defense union. And I'm happy to discuss, especially Trump, Russia, and Brexit on any level with you when I'm done in a few minutes. But so obviously with the election of Trump, NATO was thrown into a lot of uncertainty, or the perception of NATO's viability, especially from the point of view of the Europeans, was really uncertain, because they felt as though Trump didn't support it. And in fact, he was saying it was outdated and so on, and he was calling upon Europeans to pay what they owe, which really made no sense in many ways. Immediately after the election of Trump, there was a quick opinion poll on what Europeans thought of his election. Only 9% of them said that the US would, quote, do the right thing in its foreign policy under a Trump presidency. So going into it, there's this heavy degree of skepticism. And the EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, said in the wake of his election, there's a need for Europeans to take care of themselves in security terms. So you see this pattern again that I've mentioned. Whenever the relationship between the US and Europe becomes more rocky, Europeans tend to prepare themselves to act separately from the US, even though, and this is crucial. They would much rather prefer to work with the United States. The transatlantic relationship is the most important thing to them. So they would prefer that, but if they see a huge divergence in norms and foreign policy from the US, they prepare themselves. They get concerned when a US president doesn't share their values, and they also get concerned when a US president signals isolationism. But there's a deeper challenge to that as well with Trump and also with some previous US presidents, and that is the continual mixed signals that comes from the United States in terms of what they want Europeans to do in terms of defense. So the standard narrative is, why doesn't Europe do more? Why are they spending so much on welfare and the short work week instead of actually spending properly on defense and, carrying their own weight in all of this? It's the standard narrative. Why don't they spend more? But the thing is that every time the US, and usually the US president, takes a really strong stance and goes to Europe and says, spend more, the Europeans start to take that action. And it's really only a matter of, days later that the Americans come back and say, but don't go too far with this, because we don't want you to duplicate NATO, and we don't want you to discriminate NATO. I mean, this goes back to a famous speech by Madeleine Albright, kind of chastising the Europeans in the wake of their new common security and defense policy, not to take it so far. And the same thing happened with Trump. He went to Europe, and I'm sure you saw the news coverage where he really did scold Europeans for not spending enough. The Europeans then took quite bold steps, which I'll talk about in a moment, towards defense union. And right after the announcement of these steps, the US ambassador to NATO told them not to take it too far, to step back, that, wait a minute, yes, we did ask you to spend more, but this is a little concerning, this talk of defense union. So it's not as simple as the Europeans seem to not want to do it. There is some, resistance. It's a slow process, but the messages from across the Atlantic continually seem to be mixed, which I think is a kind of problem there. Secondly, with Russia and its more aggressive posturing, there is this sense now that whereas at the beginning of this century, the beginning of the 21st century, it was taken for granted that Russia, was completely on board with looking towards the West, with cooperating. There was talk of Russia potentially joining NATO. There was even talk of small talk of Russia potentially joining the EU. There were joint exercises with Russia and NATO, the verge of creating the visa-free regime with Russia and the EU. All of these things were going on. But starting with, I would say, the 2008 Russian-Georgian war, the relationship and sort of the image of Russia in the West, and particularly in Europe, started to deteriorate. And now I think it's pretty safe to say that the relationship between Russia and the EU is at its worst since the end of the Cold War. And it's happening on many levels. After, of course, the Russian-Georgia war, you have Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, but it goes deeper than that in some ways, because there's a kind of hybrid war strategy coming out of Russia that includes many things that maybe are not so visible, but all the way from propaganda to, sending troops quietly into Ukraine or less quietly, however you observe that situation. But, the latest kind of example of this is, of course, the poisoning of the former spy in the UK, and all of the EU stands by the UK, and NATO also expressed support for the UK. There's more or less an assumption that Putin was behind the poisoning of the former spy, although there has to be an investigation, and so it's not entirely sure. Not all member states are completely positive that this is what happens, but it's how they're basically discussing it now. So everything from propaganda to territorial defense, trying to sway elections, Russians spending money to support the far right and sometimes far left extreme populist parties in Europe. All of this creates a sense that the EU has to, again, be stronger in its own approach, in its own voice, in how it deals with Russia, and just more generally, this catalyst for a reason to have a defense union. And then with Brexit, you know, as I said, it actually creates a kind of opening. It's of course not a great thing by any means that the UK is leaving the EU, and I could go on and on about Brexit for a long time, but it's an unfortunate situation that probably shouldn't have happened, but it's on the path to happening. Maybe something will derail it, but as long as it goes forward, there is a situation where there's an opportunity for the Europeans to integrate further in ways they couldn't with the British in the room. So I think there's going to be a loss, of course, of the UK's contribution to security and defense, unless, again, it chooses to still participate in the defense union after it leaves, which it may have the possibility of doing that. But it's one of the biggest spenders, and we'll have to kind of see. But generally, the sense is, in my view, that Brexit does create an opportunity. It's a kind of silver lining, because it's, of course, not a good thing, but it creates an opportunity for more integration. So then, just to kind of think about how is the EU responding to this latest group of catalysts, I wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis, but really just multiple prongs of impetus, motivation to integrate. Generally, the EU does think that because it is the largest economy in the world, it has a responsibility to be a security actor on some level, that it can't just sort of sit by and not try to contribute to securing regions of the world, engaging in peace operations and humanitarian missions and so on. They also view that many of the challenges out there, like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, perhaps, the environment, and so on, these are things that have to be dealt with in common. They can't be solved by any one country on its own. So there is that sense, that sort of normative sense of what Europe should do. So some of the pieces of the backbone for defense union are now appearing on the horizon. The first thing I would point to is the 2016 global strategy, which is a kind of update to that 2003 security strategy I talked to you about. It's a big document. It's much more detailed than the 2003 version. It has many kinds of messages of what they hope to achieve. All the member states agree to it, including the UK, actually. But it goes through in quite a bit of detail, talking about the need to really preserve peace in all these regions of the world before conflicts arise. And it's not a secret that really, you know, this is in Europe's interest as well, that if they're able to solve some of these problems and stabilize them on other people's shores, then less of these problems will eventually arrive on their own shores. So this is a goal, and you know, there is this characterization, as the foreign policy chief calls it, of the EU as a peace superpower. It's aiming for peace even as it pursues these security goals. And the kind of components of the defense union that the US ambassador to NATO was kind of railing against, but really came out in the wake of Trump's chastisement of the Europeans, are these three. One of them, permanent structured cooperation, is essentially this goal for the member states to really take the initiative in integrating their defense capabilities and industries and equipment, more so even than they have been doing through the defense agency. The establishment of a defense fund which would pay for that. So for the first time, you're actually getting a goal of, and actions have been taken as of June 2017, to have common money for research and technology. It's very small so far. It's only 25 million for research and technology, 500 million on development and acquisition. But the goal is to get it up to around, I think, $1 billion in the coming years, and then increasing it even further. So it's the kernel of this common funding on defense that would be part of a future budget. And in the next term, when they create a common budget, which is 2020, they would basically go for that. And then finally, there's much talk of the creation of a European armed forces, which is different from a European army, and that's an important distinction there. It's not the same thing. The idea is that countries would still voluntarily have forces that would be at the ready for various missions and operations. It's not this kind of notion of, are you willing to die for the EU, like in the same sense as a national union? These are the sort of voluntary humanitarian peacekeeping operation types of forces. But who knows where it will eventually go. Just to conclude, I've been talking quite a bit about, the EU taking all these steps towards becoming this military actor in defense, and I don't mean to imply that this is necessarily a good thing, right? I mean, the question is still out whether this is actually necessarily where they should go or where they want to go. Should the EU try to become a state-like actor in this sense with hard power capabilities? The strength of the EU has actually been its soft power, its diplomatic power, its ability to spread norms, to say that it's not an actor that uses force unless it's a last resort, that it's an actor that wants to be legitimate, that will always have a UN resolution to take any of these kinds of actions, that upholds democracy and human rights and the environment as a top priority. So it's worth actually considering this. Many citizens in Europe don't even think it helps, like developing more military capability. They see the US doing it. They see Russia and China increasing that. They don't necessarily think that the world is getting more secure as a result of that. So, I just kind of end with this question of whether the EU should sort of capitalize on its uniqueness and maybe shy away from just replicating the other states in the international system, or perhaps creating some kind of model where it is able to really focus on its soft power, but in certain instances where it feels it's very legitimate and there's no other sort of possibility, it could combine that soft power with hard power, which is known as smart power. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to discuss anything.
That was wonderful, thank you. I'm a little vague on NATO. Does NATO have a permanent set of people from all the European and US as part of the army, or is it a volunteer kind of mission-based like you were describing for Europe?
Great, yeah, good, that's a good question. I mean, NATO definitely has a headquarters where there are personnel there all the time working on various things. But typically, if they have a mission or, well, in this case, usually an operation like in Afghanistan or something, they will ask the member states of NATO if they're willing to contribute and how many troops they're willing to contribute. And so it's very intergovernmental. So the EU is pretty unique in the sense that it does have this greater than cooperation kind of approach. It's actually integrated in many ways. In almost all policy areas, in fact, there's some level of integration. And, but NATO is like a standard international organization where member states can, not participate, and they can choose the degree to which they would participate. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was very informative. My question concerns the diversity of views within the European Union, because there is a tendency to speak of the European Union as an actor. And really it's a conference call. There are multiple actors in it, and you have done so much great work on that. One of the things that has happened in Europe is the European Union itself now is a very different animal after the 2004 enlargement, and there's a lot of difference in views, as you pointed out. The Central Europeans are much more pro-NATO, they are much more hawkish on Russia. Germany, Italy, and some of the neutral countries are really not necessarily comfortable with that. So my question is, could you comment on some of the back and forth and shifts of power and ebb and flow within the European Union with respect to these parties that want the EU to become more state-like, more hawkish, and those that are really quite uncomfortable with that?
Yeah, that's also a really great question. that type of question actually took me to Brussels, I guess, almost 10 years ago to do a bunch of interviews to find out what exactly is going on in that respect. And I think, like your question alludes to, there is a tendency for us to focus on the capitals of the EU and the narrative and policy preferences that are coming out of those capitals in the 28, or since Denmark doesn't participate, really 27. But when it comes to actual policy making, though, on foreign policy, the emphasis is quite a bit on Brussels, I would say. As a result of my interviews, I found that it's really these committees in Brussels where they can all sit at the same table and hash things out on these operations and missions that decisions are made. And I was so surprised by this, especially when I spoke with the military, the generals and admirals, that I then decided I better go to the capitals and talk to the people in the capitals and find out, is it true that as they're characterizing it, they have flexibility with their instructions, they're able to persuade member states who were opposed to something to shift their view? Is it true that this dynamic actually happens in Brussels? And even the British, even going to London and talking to the people who instruct their representatives in Brussels, they said decision-making happens somewhere in the space between London and Brussels. So even in that very hard case, we hear, especially in the media, the vast differences in views, but the EU is incredibly good at internal diplomacy. And so this process of deliberation, of kind of making the case for something with an overarching norm of wanting to cooperate and agree when they come out of the room, I think makes a really big difference. There, of course, will always be instances in which they won't agree to things. I think Iraq is a key example of this. Before it was a transatlantic divide, it was an intra-European divide, and a sharp one at that. So, of course, there will always be instances in which they can't agree on foreign policy, but it is getting to the point, I think, where they do see things similarly much more than they do differently.
So here in this country, the terrorist attack, particularly 9/11, exposed one of our dirty little secrets about how power and money control everything. And for example, our agencies like the FBI, CIA, so on, were not cooperating, had no single system and so on, in order to have worked towards that, still have a lot of problems in working together in terms of our security. That's one. The other dirty little secret, having been in the military, is that our military doesn't really cooperate that much among branches. For example, each branch will go and develop their own airplane, even though they have the exact same criteria of what they need from that airplane, and it costs us billions and billions of dollars. And a lot of that is not because of our security, but it is because of the industry and the elites in this country who make money from the military. So now I'm going to ask you about Europe. So are those two things at play as well in the EU? One, the power thing, which we saw in the recent terrorism in Europe, and the lack of cooperation among the different countries, police forces and their databases. And then secondly, how about the purchase or working on it? Because if you think of cooperation in one way, you can really save money, which we haven't really done in this country, but they could do, is have a single purchase agreement for arms and so on moving forward.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think with counterterrorism in the EU, there's definitely, it's still a work in progress, that's for sure. But where it came from was initially around 2003 or 4 or so, when I started looking at counterterrorism policy. There wasn't even a common definition of terrorism. And in fact, only 5 or 6 member states had actually regular experience with terrorism. So they went from that to saying, we need to start thinking of terrorist attacks as a European issue with a European solution because of Schengen, because it's internally borderless. So I traced this policy over time as it moved forward, and it was gradual. The European Parliament tends to kick in quite a bit on issues like this because they're concerned about protecting civil liberties. But in this, I just published an article on the terrorist attacks in the 2015-16 period. There were so many of them, unfortunately. But you see a kind of rapid pushing through of policies that were in the pipeline to work together. Intelligence sharing is one of the hardest areas, though, especially because you're not talking about just different agencies in one country. You're talking about 28 countries. So they do have an intelligence center, which is embedded in the European External Action Service. It's relatively small. I did get to interview the head of it a couple of times and talk about how things are developing. They're saying that the landscape for intelligence sharing is strongest in the informal area. So you're seeing more and more intelligence operatives actually meeting together in various forums and sharing best practices and figuring it out. So there's movement there. There's still a long ways to go, but there's movement. As far as the industries, I would say in Europe, we do have to look at a comparison again to the United States. As I said, Europe always looks to the United States either to compare itself or to figure out, where are the signals as to what it should do in security and defense. And in this case, it was more of a competitive comparison. For a period of time, the military security industries in Europe were suffering very, very badly. This was in the lead up to the creation of the European Defense Agency. And the personnel working on defense had declined by half in a relatively short period of time. So part of this impetus of economies of scale is to actually say that contracts should be multinational. They should all be advertised through the European Defense Agency's portal, which they are now. If it's at least $1 million for a call, it has to be there, and multiple countries should participate. So there's been a rapid flurry of mergers and acquisitions and multiple kinds of collaborations on these various equipment challenges.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more? Chickens out, sorry.
Thank you. So I'm Jürgen Salah from the European Commission. I will talk tomorrow about European climate policy. And I must say it's really a treat for me to be here and listen to a number of very insightful presentations about my home, the place I work for, and where I work. So thank you very much for that. I feel compelled actually to offer 2 comments to this presentation. And the first one, I think, is a very, very important one, which you gave in your introduction to this presentation. And that is, don't forget that the European Union is a peace project. You used a different word, security. But it's indeed how we started. And that's the whole idea of the European Union. After, our favorite pastime for 1,500 years were basically to do wars with each other, and finally, after this horrible century we had last century, the coin dropped with some American help, don't forget about that, and EU started. So I think that is very important, and when I do presentations to students, undergraduates, I always highlight this. We have a lot of cooperation, a lot of economic and technical cooperation and competence, but don't forget about that. It's very, very important, and that's why I think, in essence, why we have been successful in the enlargement as well. The second comment I had was, I thought you had a very good slide. I think it was saying different member state perspectives on the common security and defense policy. And you could use that actually as a very good general statement. I mean, this is the essence of the European Union. You could take any given policy area almost, and you will find all these different member state perspectives because we are so very different, and what I would almost say it's not sometimes so important what we do. The important thing is how we do it, and that came out very nicely with the previous questions and this comment that you followed up on how we do it internally. And the fact that we now have decades and 15 years or something after enlargement of a tradition and experience, a working method, just sitting together and talk things through. And, you could say that we're a continuous talking shop. We only negotiate. But that's the only way of solving issues. And we usually end up with some kind of solution. It's not normally perhaps always the most optimal ones, but we have the tradition of revisiting it. And I think this came through very nicely in this case study. So thank you very much for that. And then just perhaps a final reflection, and I think, isn't it ironic that in these days where we're talking about the Transatlantic Divide and we speak about Brexit as a new challenge, what language are we using in the European Union when we sit together and do all these negotiations? When we sit together, all of us, almost always English. When we have technical meetings, when we have full level plenary, of course, we do it in our official languages with a simultaneous interpretation, which is a kind of amazing feat in itself that we managed to do that. But it's English. It's the language of Britain and the United States. And I would bet that even if we now will have a Brexit, we will continue to do so. And you should not, as native speakers, you should not underestimate the power of the English language on the European continent. It's not only that we use it as such, and you will always be an advantage when you speak to us because it's your native language, you grew up with it, but it's also the culture. We are now, the young generations, my kids, they are so influenced by popular culture, and we all use English as a second language now. That was not the case only a few generations back, well, only one generation back. So that is, I think, just a very interesting reflection on when we speak about European Union, even when Europeans speak about European, we use English. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. Just to echo your first point, which I always like to make as well, when the Eurobarometer asks citizens what do they care about most or what do they appreciate most about the EU, after freedom of movement, they say peace. So you might think, oh, it's World War II and everyone's forgotten about it, but they haven't. It's usually the second or top thing that is mentioned by Europeans is the fact that it brought peace to the continent. So thank you very much.
That was Northwestern University's Dr. Mai'a Cross discussing Europe, Russia, and the Transatlantic Divide, security relations in turbulent times. The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, presented the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World, with support from AEL&P, Kerr Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight and Associates, Sea Alaska, the Prospector Hotel, and Wastman and Associates.